Hi, I'm Seamless, and it is now time for a new production basics tutorial thing. Today is going to be about mastering, a very sought after, much asked about, controversial sometimes thing. It's gonna be a pretty wordy one, but to kind of show off what's going to happen, I have two things here. I have a recording of the pre-master of a track that I made. That's this guy here with the peaks normalized to 0 dB. This is the mix. This is what was going into the master when I was making the track. And then down here is the result of the master that I applied to it. I'm going to play through both. And then we'll talk about sort of important things. I have no effects being played on any of these. This is where the pre-master is. This is where the master is. They both have limiters on them, but they're not on. And the pre-master is going into the actual master channel. This is where I recorded the master. This is actually from the original track. So I could talk about sort of how this got turned into this. But I'm just gonna play these two things. We'll start talking about what the point of mastering is, kind of how people tend to think about it, and other sort of mostly philosophical discussion about what mastering is. And then we'll get into the technical aspects of it, which are honestly not that complicated. So here's this thing but here. All right, that was the pre-master version. Now here's the master version. Indeed. If you're unfamiliar with what the term sausage means, this is where this is from. So now let's talk about what mastering is. My understanding of what mastering is that it's related to the idea of when people say mix and master. And I feel like a lot of things that people tend to attribute to what mastering does is actually responsibility taken in the mixing process. What mastering is, for me, is that mastering takes the vision of the mix and makes it as loud as possible while still retaining that vision without screwing with it too hard. That's kind of just how I approach the idea. Now, in traditional musical genres, production usually has two phases. It has the mix process and then the master process. You make your pre-master, and the idea of the pre-master is that you're mixing it to sound as good as it can get to be for you, you think it sounds great, without mastering compression. And then you send this to a mastering engineer, or you yourself master it separately, and then you try to master it to be as loud as possible while still retaining that vision of the track. And for quote-unquote traditional genres, all the way up to like the heaviest of metal, regular rock, like classical and like jazz and whatever, this is, I think, a reasonable idea. As far as I also know, the original intention of what mastering meant was that it made it so that the track itself sounded good on as many listening environments as possible, like, in cars and on speakers and the movie theaters, that kind of thing. And then also in the case of there being albums, you normalize things and so that the loudness all sounded together, so that they all sounded like they're at the same level. Because the whole reason why the loudness war exists, is from my own observation, is the idea that you can't, like, humans think that louder things sound better. And I don't mean that like it's an opinion. I mean like our brains are wired for us to interpret as louder things to have of more quality. There's a whole bunch of psychoacoustic stuff that has to do with that. I don't know what any of it is, but I know that that was the result of such research. Now, this means that if one track is just louder sounding than another, then if a DJ were to mix something that from two completely different artists who had nothing to do with each other, and one was just louder than the other, this would mean that the one that was louder would seem better, and the one that wasn't as loud would actually seem worse in comparison. Even if by itself it would have seemed totally fine. For the average listener, that's pretty much what would happen. So everyone will always want to have everything be louder and bigger and louder, mostly louder. And the idea of what loudness means actually has very little to do with level. I mean, it does have to do with level, but it's not as if we're just taking this and cranking it. Because at the end of the day, this is normalized to 0 dB, and so is this. It's just that this guy spends an awful lot more time at 0 dB than this guy does. And that's more or less what's up with that. Now, as far as getting to this position from this position, I don't do the traditional thing. I know a lot of people who do. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but because they end up arriving at this same position. So let's talk about this mix, this pre-master, the way this works. The way that this is mixed right now, if I were actually mixing this to sound quote unquote as best as it can possibly sound without mastering compression, this isn't the mix that I would arrive at. This, because right now, if you listen to like the balance of this, it sounds like the drums are way too loud. The everything else is pretty ridiculously quiet, and every so often there's like weird peaks that sound like weirdly loud and everything else, and like the balance is not wonderful. And the reason why this works is because what I have done essentially when I make any track is that I pretty early on, like usually when I'm done making like the first few bits of a drop, I'll create I'll mix and master the entire thing within the project. So I'll have this, I'll be having this mix going on, and I'll have my mastering effects on. And then anytime I make any changes or add any new elements, they're all going to be under the compression the whole time, so that I know immediately what it'll sound like. And I also know kind of what changes to make. Because if you do the mix master separation thing where you're doing the mix yourself and then you have someone else master or you yourself are mastering it, generally what happens is that you have to go through a whole lot of revisions. You send in the thing to your mastering engineer, or you do it yourself, and you discover that, oh, there's a whole bunch of stuff I have to change in the mix. Because, for example, if I did make this mix to be more balanced so that the non-percussion elements were seemingly as loud as the percussion elements, and then I tried to compress that would be a lot muddier sound. It would be a lot muddier sounding than what's happening here. And this has to do with the reason why I kept referring to those other genres as traditional genres. Because modern genres, like this right here, electro, or just bass music in general, a huge portion of how this music sounds and feels is actually the result of mastering. Like, it's actually the result of the particular kind of compression that we use on the master. It's not born of a mixing decision. Mixing decisions are involved, but it's the result of the mastering that makes it what it sounds like. Which is why it's really hard to do the whole pre-master concept where you're trying to make the track sound like you feel like it sounds like in your head, when you can't get that sound without using compression, because that's just how the style rolls. And as a result, like this mix is what happens when I mix the track with the mastering compression on the whole time. I actually didn't know what this sounded like until the first time I took off the mastering just to see what it would sound like. In the past, I've done this for other tutorials and for lessons and stuff like that. And the other thing is that I was saying that this was normalized to 0 dB. And if I take it off, it actually gets louder. And a lot of people might be confused with what the hell is happening, because normalizing is supposed to mean that it makes it louder up to 0 dB. And this has to do with the whole 32-bit idea. I've actually done a video on 32-bit floating point bit depth and what that means. But I'll just give you a brief idea. And essentially what this means is that 0 dB doesn't actually distort anything. It doesn't cut off any information. if I redline a mixer insert into the master, it's redlining. It's going above 0 dB, but it's not cutting off that information. If I turn down the master, even though these inserts are redlining, it'll still not distort anymore. So when I normalize a 32-bit floating point audio file like this is, and it has information above 0 dB, which it does, it actually brings it down to 0 dB. So it brings down the loudest point, the loudest peak, down to 0 dB and everything else with it. Your standard pre-masters usually are at -6 dB because that's what mastering engineers ask for. Beyond the idea of having your peaks below 0 dB, there are other safety concerns that mastering engineers like to have. That's why they kind of tell you to have the -6 dB idea. And this is, there's a lot of reasons for that. Largely speaking, if you're doing it yourself, it's not a humongous deal. And the reason why this works for me is because this is all happening in the original track. I've taken it out of the track just so that we have a more traditional look at what's happening, but I never render out something to be mastered again. It's all live running into the master, and then the only render that ever happens is the final printed version that goes to, you know, the album. So that's why when I normalize it brings it down, just so I'm confused about that. But I mean, I'm telling you this because this is the level at which it actually goes into the master. And the reason why I'm normalizing it is because while the information itself isn't distorting, if we actually try to listen to it, it actually will distort because our playback to our audio interfaces is usually 16-bit or 24-bit. There are 32-bit audio interfaces, but it's actually not super important because just about every end user piece of equipment will play back at a bit depth or a file type that limits to 0 dB. So that's why everything has to come back down to 0 dB before it goes final out. Indeed. So the whole idea I was trying to talk about with the whole traditional versus modern thing is that usually what ends up happening is that the changes that you make in your mix when you're doing your revisions will get it to sound like this, where we have the heavy hitting elements, the drums, are really, really a lot louder than everything else. This is because when we compress everything else back up, the disruption, the loudness of the drums cause is that kind of feel that we expect from a genre like this. As well, when you're doing it, when you're mixing it and you're mastering it at the same time, you're not really surprised by anything. You know how everything is behaving. You can make the changes accordingly. Like if there's too much high frequencies on like a reverb or something, you don't have to like send it to the mastering engineer and have the mastering engineer freak out about it and try really hard to fix it when you're just like, oh, I'll just turn it down, and then that's the end of it. Like it's mostly a time saving thing, especially if you're doing it yourself. I'm not saying this is the perfect method or that it's even the best method, but it's just a method that I use, and these are the reasons why I like it. Now, as far as how you actually go about doing this, let's look at the pre-master. Let's actually turn on the mastering effects and unnormalize it. My mastering chain consists of a pre-compression EQ and a compressor, multiband compressor. There are a lot of options in terms of like plugins you can use to accomplish this. These are pretty like this EQ is pretty ridiculously basic. Like you can get a much more hardcore EQ to be very specific about things, but I tend not to have to. I don't know how that was, but just an EQ your stuff. That's what this is. And then the actual fun of the mastering is this guy. Now, Maximus is a multiband wave shaping compressor. Which don't worry about the wave shaping part. It's the idea that it's a multiband compressor. The whole point of a multi-band compressor is that instead of compressing the entire spectrum of frequency all at once, you have however many bands you have. Some plugins have 3, this has 3, some of them have 4, some of them have 5. And even with with Patcher, you can make yourself like a 10 band, which I've done, which I don't recommend, but you can. The purpose of a multi-band compressor is that if you have like a giant peak in your low end, and with a regular compressor, what this would mean is that you have a big ass peak, and then the compressor brings it down, and then it brings down everything else with it. And if we have a multi-band compressor, it'll bring down only the low end, and the mid and the highs will be left alone. So this will mean that it's a relatively transparent compression profile, which is supposedly the benefit. It's supposed to be the benefit of a multi-band compressor. However, As you might have heard by listening to how the actual master rolls, I really am not a fan of transparency. Because again, the way that this genre feels, to me at least, is actually just tremendously the result of a lot of compression. And it sounds great. And it feels good, man. Now, where I make the splits is determined entirely by where the drums sit. Because this represents pretty much the three parts of a drum kit: the kick, the snare, and the hats. If you look at the spectrum while it's playing, you can see I make the mid cut a little bit below where the fundamental tone of the snare is. If you can't see it pretty well here, you'll see it pretty well over here. That's the loudest and lowest part of a snare, depending on how you mix it. But generally speaking, that's the case, especially for more modern genres. So that makes the split pretty easily. This means that the loudest elements that the lows are going to deal with are going to be the kick. The loudest element that the mids are going to deal with are going to be the snare. And then the loudest elements that the highs are going to deal with are pretty much everything, because higher frequencies require a lot less power to sound loud as everything else, which usually means you can pile on as much as you want. Not really have to worry about stuff. So I don't really worry. I don't fuss too much about the higher frequencies unless I'm doing something particularly interesting, which I don't think I am right now. Now, a huge portion of how a song sounds and how it's arranged and how it's presented at this level has to do with how you mix stuff. I've already done a video on like what mixing technically is and how you go about it, so I'm not going to really rehash a whole lot of that. It's just that like I want to reiterate that a lot of things that people think mastering does is actually just the product of a good mix. Mastering can make things sound pretty great, but it can't really save bad. You know what I mean? So work on your mixes first and foremost. Just do that. Now, as a result of the way that I did the mix, I have, in this low end, you can see a pretty smooth, kind of even profile, even without the compression, which you can see is the result of the green area here. In the beige area, it's actually rather level. And this is because I've high-passed everything and replaced the low end with a separate sub, a sine wave that is, well, it's a bit more than that. It's a couple of harmonics in a sine wave. Well, it's mostly a sine wave. And it's underneath everything. Every other sound is being high-passed. So that means that in the low end, the only two things that are down there are this separate sub and the kick low end. This makes mastering it ultra easy. In fact, even what I've done here, this weird complicated shape that I created in the input output, it was largely unnecessary because it was already doing kind of what I wanted to do. And what I've done here is preserve the idea of dynamic range. So what is dynamic range, and why have you heard people clamoring to talk about this in the face of what they also refer to as the loudness wars? I don't know, more than one war. Dynamic range is the measurement between the highest and lowest peak in a sound, basically. Not necessarily because, I mean, the lowest peak as in when the sound is created, there's a peak. Not necessarily the lowest actual sound, because it's always going to be 0, which means that, oh, my dynamic range is infinity. That's not what that means. So in this case, the dynamic range that I've created here is minus 6 dB and then 0 dB. So 6 dB dynamic range in the low end. Because, I mean, you could look at the master. I sold the low end here, but look at the master. The resulting sum of the dynamic range of everything is dismal. There's barely any. And while this is true for the primary, everything being, added together, because this is the way that the multiband works, that you get your 3 bands, and then you have a single band master that you use to bring everything back down again. But if we go to the low end and the mids and the highs, you can see there's actually quite a bit of dynamic range going on in the individual bits of the spectrum. It's just that when they're added together, it's very crunchy. And this is there's a bit of a balancing act you have to do here if you really want to preserve dynamic range, because the whole idea that louder things sound better is certainly true, and louder things contrasted with quieter things also makes a louder thing sound better. And this is why dynamic range is objectively better. If the world were all like the pre-masters, where the drums were a lot louder than everything else, just without compression, just hugely louder, when that was turned up really loud, it would have sounded really freaking great. It would have sounded like incredibly impactful, just really like super duper hard hitting, and the dynamic range would be 100% responsible for that. However, that's not viable for a whole lot of reasons. And the solution to that is just to crush the stuff forever. But even though we're crushing everything, we're doing it in a very subtle ways beneath it that are kind of preserving the idea of dynamic range, which is why I do what I do in the low end here, because I have this shelf at the bottom here represents the separate sub as it is originally played. And what you want in your low end mix is not necessarily a loud bass, because I could make the bass up at 0 dB with the kick and it would be the same level, but because it's exactly as loud as the low end of the kick, we would not hear as much a distinguishing, like we wouldn't really hear the distinguish between the kick and the bass. But because I made the kick noticeably louder than the bass, the kick itself the bass feels much more impactful as a result. And really, we don't want to have a loud bass, but we want to have a consistent bass. Because as long as it's consistently there, we will feel it more than we'll hear it, and our brains will psychoacoustically fill in the gaps, and we'll hear and feel lots of bass. That's one of that. That's how that works, basically. And I do varying different versions of this from pretty much all my tracks. The mids and highs, however, I don't do a huge amount of actual compression. Now, also, let's talk about what compression actually means. I've already done a video on this, but I'll do it again. I'll talk about it again. Because there's compression and there's also the idea of expansion. And lots of people have pointed out that when I'm bending the curve like this up and it's bringing up everything, that's technically expansion. And while that might be the name of the process, it's still compression. Because what we're compressing is the dynamic range. And whether or not we're crushing it up or crushing it down, we're still crushing it. So that means that we are lessening the dynamic range and overall still compressing things. Because that's what compression means. All that means is that we're reducing the amount of dynamic range. And we're using that in conjunction with a whole bunch of other stuff like makeup gain, multiband splitting, saturation, which we'll talk about in a second, and all that stuff to come together to master something. But compression is just one part of that. Compression in and of itself is essentially just really fast volume automation. This white line up here is what we're looking at to show us what it's doing to compress the thing. So you can see here that when the kick hits, it's brought up a bit, but then when the lower bass comes up, it's actually brought up a lot more for it to level out to where the green is. The green represents output and the beige represents input. Normally purple. So that's basically how that works out. Mids and highs separate. They're louder than they would have been, but they're not that much louder. Because if you boost any individual thing, it's gonna make everything else sound kind of out of balance. So you're going to want to kind of boost it to feel. You're going to have to feel these kinds of things, especially because of how Maximus works. There's not really a lot of numbers involved. There are some numbers, but like the numbers I chose here, minus 6 dB for the shelf and 0 dB for the kick, were totally arbitrary. It was mostly just that I wanted there to be a shelf and I wanted the kick to be noticeably louder. The fact that it ended up being minus 6 and 0 dB was 100% an accident, because I didn't plan for that at all. As for the other guys, this comes back to this idea of the whole 32-bit thing, because these guys are being pushed above 0 dB before they go into the master, but as long as the master brings them back down to the end, then we're not actually losing any information. Not accidentally, anyway. So let's talk about saturation. Actually, before we talk about saturation, let's talk about the time variables for compressors. Now, most compressors usually have a threshold and a ratio knob. What the threshold knob does is it tells it where it'll begin to actually start to compress the signal. And then the ratio knob determines how hard it will compress the signal. In the case of Maximus, instead of having a threshold and ratio knob, you do what I just did there, which was directly manipulate the graph itself. Because messing with a threshold and ratio knob would have that effect on something. Now, when you have a ratio of 2-to-1, which is what I got right now, seemingly. Yeah. This means that the input signal would have to be twice as loud for it to peak at its original level above the threshold. A limiter is a kind of compressor that has an infinite ratio, which means to say that it's not going to go above the threshold at all. Otherwise referred to as a ceiling at that point. It is still compression, though. It's a kind of compression. The time variables we have all these guys up here. And this is represented differently on most plugins, but generally speaking, you have your release time and your attack time. And that's pretty common. Maximus, I've done a tutorial on Maximus. I recommended you watch that because Maximus and the limiter have interesting terminology in terms of how it handles these things. But for the time being, I'm only going to focus on the release time. Now, if we play this, if we zoom in, you can see the product of what the release time does. So like I said, this white line represents the sort of the automation of the compressor to automate the volume to the point where it'll control dynamic range in real time. It's actually kind of awesome. This is what analog compressors do as well, just a lot faster because they're analog. Which is not necessarily a good thing because right now, for example, I have a really long release time on the bass. And the reason for that is because you do not want to have a release time that's faster than the wavelength of your sound. This is because if it is faster, then it'll start to shape the waveform, otherwise known as wave shaping, otherwise known as distortion. So you don't want to end up doing that. But notice this very wide swath of like very loose kind of compression. And we can look at the mids and the highs. You can see it actually adheres pretty closely. And on the master, it adheres really closely. You can see a peak. You can see each individual peak gets its own little compressing moment. And what this essentially is doing is that it lets the uncompressed peaks, which are actually are way below the threshold, it's allowing them to be where they were, which means that overall the sound, the total sum of all the sound spends more time closer to 0 dB, which means that it actually comes across as being louder. Yeah. Faster release time means it'll essentially be louder, and too fast means that it'll fuck with your waveform. Now, so that means then the low end, which is predominantly bass, which is predominantly really large wavelengths, I have kind of a big release time. Mids and highs can have a slower, or rather a faster release time, mostly set to ear and necessity. And then the master, I actually have in total a pretty fast release time, even though the bass is involved in here. And if the bass actually does get loud enough where it gets interfered with, it actually interferes with the threshold, then it would actually wave shape it. But you can tell at the times that really when that happens is usually when the hardest hitting elements happen, with it. And this is actually why saturation works. So I'm using the soft saturator, which is this guy up here. And this is the way it works at Maximus. And there's a lot of other options, other plugins that do something similar. Often it could be called harmonic excitement. It could be called a bunch of other things. Like it's essentially what this is just distortion. It distorts things going above a particular ceiling. In this case, the ceiling is at 0 dB. Here's the ceiling. Now notice what happened there. When I set the ceiling really low, it sounded really distorty, like noticeably and obviously distorted. This is the result of not so much the level, like it's not because it's quiet. It's because of how far above the ceiling the signal was pushed. If I brought it down to minus 12 dB, that would mean that it got pushed up like 18 dB above the ceiling, and that meant that the distortion became a lot lower frequency than it was initially, which means that it's really, really obvious. But it's at 0 dB, and the peaks were really only going 6 dB above it. The distortion is present and it's there, but it's not that noticeable. And there's a reason for that. And this is because distortion in general, the way that it works digitally, and the result of which that it works in some analog distortion modules, I'm not 100% certain about this, but in the digital world anyway, the product of distortion is usually that it adds higher harmonics to a sound. And this is all well and good. And this song has an unbelievable amount of high frequency content because most of the elements that I'm using in this track are already distorted. The basses, the hats, the kicks, the snare. I mean, especially the snare, like that quality, the kind of quality of a snare is distortion. And like all the sounds are either very high frequency rich or distorted already, which means that if we add in a little bit of it, it's not going to be a big deal. Now, the question you might be asking is, why are we doing this anyway? What's the point of this? When I first discovered soft saturation, I didn't understand what it was doing. I referred to it as free compression. Because when you compress something, like you see this peak over here below the pause symbol, when you're compressing it, it has to react to the time variables. And you can't always have the fastest time variables for everything that happens. And if you have really sharp transients that spend only a little bit of time above the threshold, then having a really fast transient, a really fast time variable on compression is great because it means that it goes in, it goes out, and the snappiness is preserved. That's really the benefit of doing this, that it preserves snappiness. The problem with that, though, is that it would also introduce snappiness to things that aren't supposed to be snappy. And that the results of that are actually a lot worse than if you were to just distort it as we are right now. And the distortion option is saying that it's going to cut it above at 0 dB and it's going to cut it really hard. And it'll add distortion, but if we have enough already, high frequency content, that's not a big deal. Not only that, but notice we are actually still compressing. This is actually because what's happening is I'm doing both. I'm doing actual compression and I'm doing soft saturation. So that means I'm not getting the kind of muddy, groggily, stupid, over compressed sound that we get from using too much compression too hard on like a 0 dB brick wall limit. And we're also not getting it's being pushed too hard above the ceiling of the soft saturation to make it sound too distorted. We're combining the two to get the best of both worlds. And what that is going to be different for every song that you do. Because you're going to have to kind of like finagle around with it. Yeah. I just had a whole lot of stuff, and now I'm not sure what the hell I'm talking about anymore. I know. Okay. All right. Yeah. So that's pretty much what's going on in the master, that kind of thing. The low, mid, high idea is that you want to create, usually anyway, the proper way would be to try and create as flat a peaking profile going into the master as you can, because it means that you're getting it to fit particularly well together through compressing the individual bands. And what that is going to be different for every track, and because predominantly how the stuff fits together is still going to be a product of your mix. Like, because again, this can only save so much damage. It can accentuate some really good things, but notice how the mid and the highs, they're not really doing anything. They're doing a little bit. They're kind of just making it louder, but that's to compensate for what I was doing in the low end to make that louder. Like in general, a lot of what the song feels like it is doing was still accomplished with the mix process. And then the master is all about just crunching it down. For me, okay, this is like something I should say. Is I mentioned this before, but this works very well for the very loud, very distorted, heavy bass music genres, and thus pretty much everything that I make. This really wouldn't work out so well for more chill things, because if you try to push something that doesn't have a lot of high frequency content, like a liquid bass, it will suddenly have any high frequency content at all. And even that means if it gets pushed even a little bit above a soft saturation ceiling, it will add noticeable distortion. It'll add the same amount of distortion that it would add if we're doing it here, but because there's already so much going on up there, it's masked pretty well. So that's the danger. That's the danger in using it in softer situations, which is usually why, which I didn't do for this track, but what I'll end up doing, if I have softer moments, I'll actually run two Maximuses. I'll have this one, which is the hard section, and then I'll clone it and then have another one, which is all compression, all regular compression with a more forgiving time variable and maybe less gain and that kind of thing. And this is so that during the intermediary, like the breakdowns, the intros, the outros, that kind of thing, when there's softer material playing, that I won't distort audibly. The other way of doing that is just to turn the stuff down so that it doesn't go above, it doesn't peak during those times. That's also my tracks also kind of employed that technique in Momentum. Now, another thought you might be having is this idea of, well, why do we use soft saturation and why don't we just distort the master full on? Why don't we just let it clip? In fact, I'm pretty sure none of you were thinking that just now, but I guarantee you it will occur to you at some point. And the reason why you don't want to do that is because clipping distortion, from actually rendering something from like rendering it down to a bit depth that cuts off at 0 dB, is a perfect kind of distortion. It's not algorithmic. It's very, it is algorithmic, but it's not modeled. This kind of distortion is actually modeled after something. It's modeled and it's into a kind of behavior where it's causing distortion, but it's very predictable and the harmonics are all stable, which means that it should be able to be recreated and like actually played on any system and still sound the same. But if you use clipping distortion doesn't account for any of that, and you're just putting in perfectly sharp, abstract, impossible waveforms into a speaker, and the speaker will try to do it and it'll sound kind of close, but it also means that every speaker is going to behave differently on that particular element, and that'll mean that it'll come out bad. Well, I mean, it could come out bad. I mean, it'll sound, you'll obviously make it sound good for your listening environment, but it could mean that the guy listening to it on earbuds will get a much different listening experience that isn't 100% related to the fact that he's listening to it on earbuds. So that's why doing on purpose actual algorithmic modeling distortion is better than just letting it clip, in case that ever came up. Yeah. So that ended up being really in depth. I hope I didn't lose a lot of you, because that was, I mean, it's pretty straightforward stuff when it comes down to it, but it was mostly just sort of unraveling sort of interesting conceptions when it comes to the idea of mastering, and I might not have done a wonderful job. So really, if you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.